Hello and welcome. I don't know if you can see me. Hopefully you can see me. I'm Katie Ledger. I'm here with Alan Watkins, and thanks for joining us. So I know many of you joined us last week for the mental health or emotional well-being. This week we're going to be tackling the subject of teams in a crisis and why certainly some teams come together and seem to be able to deliver some really good results. So Alan's going to talk us through that. So I just wanted to go through before we get started, just show you that some of the topics that we've covered thus far. So you can see if you go to our webpage /webinars, you can see the ones that we've done on March 26th and April 2nd and the 9th, the mental health one we did last week, and also the podcasts. So we're converting those into podcasts. If you're going on that long car journey, which I'm sure many of you are not doing at the moment, but you might just want to be able to lie in bed and listen to it. So all of those are possible for you to do. And then next week, we're going to look at a different subject. And just flick through. You can see all of the 4 quadrants which Alan's talked about before, and certainly in the people leadership. So we did mental health strategies that work and don't work last week. We're doing pulling together in a crisis this week, and we're talking about managing disconnection, isolation and loneliness, which is especially relevant at the moment. We're digging into that topic next week, so please do join us same time, same place. So Alan, welcome.
Hi, Katie.
Good week. And so let's dig into it. Why do many teams seem to kind of be able to pull together in a crisis in a way that they perhaps can't in normal times?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and that's what we're going to dig into this afternoon. And there's sort of 3 factors. But if I can just back up from that question, just give a bit of context to that question. So we've been talking about, in the first of these webinars, the multi-dimensional nature of a wicked problem and the answers to all wicked problems, and COVID is the latest one. There's an interior of me, there's a relationship between you and I and us and everybody else and each other, and then there's what we're doing in the world. So we're going to talk about this. But why do human beings, teams, organizations often function better in a crisis? And the 3 bits that I want to talk about today, which is first of all, something called perspective taking. And hopefully if we can wake up to the fact that we're taking different perspectives in a crisis, not in a crisis, then what we can actually do is get better when we're in non-crisis mode. It's really fascinating. And we've heard over the years many teams saying, you know, when our backs against the wall, we had a bad quarter or something, we seemed to do really well when things were difficult. And then when things got a bit easier, we sort of disaggregated a bit. So that's to do with perspective taking. I want to unpack that in detail. So if we can wake up to that, then we might be able to sustain the benefits of a crisis beyond a crisis. There's a second piece, which is to do with purpose. It's sort of the common enemy thing. You know, people often gel and align when we're all focused on a common goal, a common purpose or a higher purpose. So that's part of it. And then thirdly, it's really interesting that sometimes the normal ego battles or the ego immaturity that you see in organizations in non-crisis mode, when we're in crisis mode, people sort of get over themselves a bit and show up a bit more sort of maturely. They stop pushing their own agenda because they realize there's a bigger thing going on beyond themselves. So there's a sort of ego immaturity. So we're going to unpack all 3 of those, waking up, owning up and growing up today, but particularly the first piece, which is the waking up and the perspective taking.
So tell us a bit more about what do you mean by perspectives? I think people got a sense of, well, you know, we can see it from his or her perspective. But what do you mean by perspective exactly?
Well, most human beings, and we'll ask everybody listening to, you know, consider which perspective they're taking, take one of 2 perspectives. So in all relationship, and this is really interesting, once you realize this is going on, this is what we call the anatomy of a relationship, is some people occupy the first person perspective, and some people show up in conversations from the third person perspective. So let me just unpack that a little bit. when you see organizations have meetings, you'll often experience, and this is very common when we share this with people, something called meeting popcorn. So somebody offers their first person, the rest of the room ignores that. Somebody offers either another first person perspective, the rest of the room ignores that. Somebody offers an observation, third person perspective, the room ignores that. So sometimes we're sat in meetings and it feels like popcorn, pop, 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 pop. And then it starts to occur to somebody, hopefully, oh my God, we've been talking for 20 minutes, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. Yes, that's because it's meeting popcorn. So that's the sort of flourish of first and third person. So first person perspective is really that subjective perspective. And you see this, and I'm sharing a couple of photos here, classically seen in the Oscar acceptance speech. It's emotional, it's passionate. So either when people are sort of table thumping in passionate advocacy, it's what we call the me, my, I perspective. So, you know, there's a lot of kind of authenticity to it. You know, people really sharing what's sort of deep in their heart or what's on their mind, but doing it very much with a lot of emotion, a lot of energy, and it's unique to them. And sometimes when you've got all that dander up and that emotion up, is you lose a bit of self-awareness. So the acceptance speech that goes on for 20 minutes when they've been told you've got 5 minutes type thing. So that's classically first person perspective. And we all can, there's no right and wrong to this. We can all take first person perspective. So I can passionately advocate for something important, for example. Now, if you don't...
Is Trump the poster child for this?
Well, everybody can access first person. Most people will operate from first person at some point in their life, particularly if they're upset. So they lose awareness, they descend into an emotion, you know, so either when red mist comes down or when excitement gets them. They're basically operating from first person perspective. So we'll ask the listeners in a moment which one they tend to prefer. Is it first person or is it third person? Now, third person is that rational observer, often a little bit cooler, there's a bit more distance, and so they tend to use different phraseology. Well, the reality is, I think you'll find the data suggests, the numbers tell a different story. It's almost like a journalist observing the phenomena from a pulled back position. So every human being will tend to flip between first and third. And so when you watch a conversation going on, it can be quite interesting to think, well, have we got two people having this conversation just operating from first person perspective, or have we got one from first and one from third? And it becomes really funny. I mean, I often think it's quite entertaining if you go to a bar or a pub and you watch two people having a conversation, trying to connect with each other, but often there's very little genuine connection at any sort of deep or meaningful level. They're basically just broadcasting at each other, often from the first person. They're almost retelling each other the same story. And the only thing that jumps the gap between two people is a single word. So, for example, let me role play a moment just to kind of bring this alive for you. What did you do at the weekend? Oh, well, I took my dog for a walk down. Oh, you've got a dog? I've got a dog. Let me tell you about my dog. And so I then retell you the story of my dog, which is very, very similar to the story you just told me of your dog. And as I'm telling you that story of my dog, I mentioned the fact that I take my dog along the canal. Oh, a canal. We've got a canal near us. Let me tell you about my canal. And so you have this really interesting, once you realize this is going on, you think, oh my God, the only thing that's jumping the gap is a single word. So they think they're connecting, but they're not really connecting on any meaningful level. They're sort of vaguely aware that they both have dogs and canals, and that's about it. So that's sort of two people stuck in first person, or you can have an argument in first person. Well, we'll have to agree to disagree then. Or, well, we obviously have a different view of the truth then. So you get people stuck in first and third, and it often disables them. The truth is we can all operate from, but sometimes people have a tendency more towards first, or so as a scientist, scientists often like to sort of pride themselves in being very rational, evidence-based and so on, and so would journalists. But interestingly, there's another perspective, which is second person perspective taking. And I just want to explain what that's about. So when you go into second person perspective taking, it's the shared perspective. It's the common ground. So when you have that meeting popcorn, somebody doing passionate advocacy of what they believe is true and they're convinced in all their years of experience and the answer is blah, blah, blah. And then somebody going, no, the data suggests, and first, third. Hopefully at some point, somebody notices we're not reaching a point of agreement and we can't therefore move forward. And sometimes that takes 45 minutes, which is why meetings are often a very inefficient thing, particularly if you have meeting popcorn. Now, in order to, get people aligned behind something, you've got to discover second person. And second person perspective taking is the common ground. Now, this is very interesting because a really good facilitator will naturally call out the common ground. But to call out the common ground effectively, you kind of have to be a little bit empty yourself. And you have to watch out for people in the first person perspective pretending to call out the common ground. So you'll hear people going, well, I think we can all agree my view. And so what they'll do is they'll sneak their own view in and pretend that's what everybody's saying, which of course it isn't. Mm-hmm. So there's genuine second person perspective taking, and the magic of all relationships, the power of all relationships gets built in second person, what we agree and what we align on. But it's pretty rare in many organizations. And so the reason that, when teams come together in a crisis is they inadvertently discover second person. They inadvertently, get some shared understanding. Well, I think we can all agree that the most important thing here is we save lives. And we sort of back into that position. And therefore we all kind of mobilize because we're all agreed on something.
Is it almost like, it seems to be like going up to a place where everybody can agree on at least on something?
Well, it might be a going up or it might be a going down. We can agree on the details or we can agree on the higher purpose. So we'll come to that, what we call the zip phenomenon. But first of all, just being really aware of, what is second person perspective taking. And so you can see whether people, spend any time at all in second person perspective. And I don't mean pretend second, basically my view snuck into the room in the pretense that it's second. And so what it looks like in a room full of people is, okay, Angela, you made this point about, this, and then Frank, you said that. And, if we take Angela's point and Frank's point and these other 3 points, what seems to be emerging is ba-dum. That's the facilitation of a common understanding. And you present it to the room to see if the room largely agrees with that. So there's a very different way of operating to flush out second person perspective taking. Mm-hmm. And so that happens pretty rarely in most organizations, pretty rarely in most teams, because most people find it difficult to access second person because it feels like if you're being invited into the second person perspective, that, well, I have to give up my belief first person. And I can't do that because I know that's true. You're asking me to ignore all my years of experience and I can't do that. So they can't get into second because they feel like they're having to give something up. And likewise, in third person, I have to give up the facts, the evidence. And the data is the data. You can't give that up, So therefore, people often stay stuck in first or stuck in third, which means they can't get into second and therefore they can't reach alignment. So the conversation goes on and on and on, and people have an arm wrestle, and they try to first or third force the others into submission. So forced compliance or forced submission is not second person perspective taking. Second person perspective is genuine alignment.
So we can talk a little bit about how, so there seems like an awful lot of awareness about, I need to be very aware of what's happening in the room to be able to reach second person perspective. And if you look at our poll results here, the majority are saying 10 to 30%
of their time they spend in second person.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's quite, in my experience, that's quite generous. I mean, I think people
Are you thinking a lot less than that, Alan?
Yes. in the teams that maybe we just, the teams we work with, but, sit in a meeting, you think people are aligning, but the alignment is often momentary. And one of the sort of disciplines we try and help teams do is, like, when you've reached a point of alignment and agreement, don't immediately jump on to the next bit of the conversation. That point of alignment agreement is critical. It's like you're putting a stake in the ground. You're building a brick in the wall. And if you layer up these bricks, you're building increasing levels of alignment. Don't rush past that moment of agreement and alignment. So we often encourage teams that when they've reached an agreement or alignment, stop and write that down, and preferably write it down that everybody can see what we have aligned on. So you've got something called shared attention. So we're all looking at the thing that we think we've just agreed. And so everybody knows we've agreed and we've banked it. And that's actually how you build. So if you take if we role play slightly a classic argument between, I don't know, a husband and a wife.
Steady, Alan.
Yes, this dangerous territory now, I know. So maybe a husband comes home and he's sort of really angry and upset about something that's happened that day. And the wife's trying to placate him and say, oh, don't worry about it, let it go. Well, you don't understand, I can't, it's so frustrating, da, da, da. And so he's basically stuck in first person, and she's sort of, not so emotional about the issue, and is just sort of giving advice from the third person perspective. And of course, the husband's sort of overwhelmed with that frustration, and the wife's thinking, well, he's bent out of shape on this one. He just needs to relax or let that go a bit. And so they start looking at each other in a sort of strange way. And he's thinking, well, my wife's not really understanding what I'm saying. Classic kind of complaint. My partner doesn't understand me. And she's thinking, well, why is he getting so bent out of shape about this? It's ridiculous. And so they start to wonder whether they've married the right person. Now, of course, that's not true. What they're failing to access is second person, is the common ground. And so what we'll often encourage people to do is to, do what we call, building shared understanding and shared beliefs. And
actually, Alan, just before we go into that, can I ask a question? Well,
sure.
Actually, Sarah Martin's asking a question. Is second person perspective taking part of recognizing and managing our unconscious confirming evidence bias?
Well, not really. I mean, it's setting it aside. Now, you may have to manage it in order to set it aside. It's kind of just parking it for a moment. So whatever our belief is, let's just park our belief and see if we can find common ground. So I might have all sorts of beliefs based on my childhood training or whatever, but I'm just going to park that for a moment and see if I can discover what you and I share. So do we have a common understanding about the details of this project? Can we agree that at least?
Yeah.
Do we agree a higher purpose? So what you're really doing, and this is why the zip metaphor is very useful, is you're trying to find some common ground, either in the middle, the macro, the generalities, the micro specifics, or the overall meta higher level. So, for example, when I was working in NHS, most doctors would agree about the NHS. It should be free at the point of delivery. That's the higher purpose. But there's very little agreement on the details. Should we have more intensive care beds or neonatal beds or more geriatric care beds, social care beds? Now, we're all arguing about that, so we can't agree on the details, but we all agree on a higher purpose. So that's where the zip is connected at the top, but not connected at the bottom. So you can have the zip connected in the middle, you can have the zip connected at the detail level, in the middle, or connected at the top. So in order to sort of create alignment, you've got to find the common ground and bank the agreement. So can we at least agree X, Y, and Z? Well, yes, I think we can both agree that I need to, not be quite as frustrated at work. Well, we can agree on that. But the point is, Frank is no, hang on a minute. Can we agree that it's important for us to discuss, how you're doing at work? Well, yes, of course we can agree. And just calling out. So what you need to do is to find, the common ground, call out that common ground, and you're building some, 3, 4, 5 bits where the zip is connected. So then you can start to discover where the zip is disconnected and then zoom in. And sometimes you go up and sometimes you go down, depending on where the point of connection is. Does it make sense?
Okay. Yep. Yep. Question from Julie Smith. Is this Thomas Kilman's top right box? Collaborate rather than compromise.
No, because sometimes collaboration, is a forced collaboration. So it can lead to a genuine collaboration. So collaboration and compromise. So this is definitely not compromise, which is really a forced capitulation. Well, I disagree with you, but I'll have to go along with it. Some sort of unhappy compromise. So if you get collaboration works when there's genuine agreement, right? Well, I can agree with that. So can we both agree that there are a number of dimensions to the COVID pandemic crisis? Can we agree that there was a health wave that, I was hitting us psychologically and physically? Can we all agree that there was a health system wave where actually the health system needed sufficient resources and enough ventilators and PPE? Can we all agree that that was important? Can we agree that there are some economic consequences? So all we're really doing is calling out something that we can all agree on. And so if we can find that common ground, then you can get a genuine collaboration. So sometimes what's called collaboration is, a trade-off, some unhappy trade-off. That's not what I'm talking about. Second person perspective is where you're entirely happy to agree because you actually believe it to be true. So it's genuine common ground. So sometimes collaboration, compromise may or may not be second person. So you have to dig in to really understand it.
Okay. So what else can we do to get into second?
So in order to get into second, there's a sort of a few tips. For example, first of all, playing back, at a more meaningful, so not just verbatiming, what the other person just said, is playing back at a deeper level, the meaning. So you said a lot of things, but it feels to me that what you really meant was blah, blah, blah. And if you play back and make the other person feel heard, then that's a great way of pulling them into second person perspective, because now you've got a shared understanding. So is what you're really suggesting, that you're really frightened about the future? Is that what you're really saying? They go, yeah, that's exactly what, okay, so we've now got common understanding. So if you play back at the deeper level, is a great way of establishing second person perspective, right? If you identify the things that benefit both of us, also a great way of getting into and building second person perspective. As I mentioned before, landing what is it we can agree on and writing that down. And cultivating, so setting aside your own belief for a moment and being a bit more fascinated with the other person, taking the right attitude. This isn't all about me, this is about us. So it's much more that us perspective. That right attitude will create a goodwill. Asking open-ended questions and acknowledging that everybody's first and third, they're all legitimate, they're all true, but they're incomplete. So if we can acknowledge that rather than I've got to beat you in the argument, either I'm right or you're right, we can't both be right. Well, it turns out we both can be right. We can be saying very contradictory things and still both of them can be true. So where's the common ground? So these are all ways of helping people to sort of access second person perspective taking. And that's one of the reasons, a big primary reason why, teams, organizations, nation states, societies can often do a lot better in a crisis because we accidentally back into second person. And the real benefit, so how much of this will sustain beyond the crisis? If we can really learn the anatomy of relationships and say, oh my goodness, I've realized there is this thing called first person, there is this thing called second, and there is this common ground in second and this objective. Now I realize there's these three different perspectives. So beyond this crisis, can I access first, second, and third? Now, if you can consciously go in and out of first, go in and out of second, and go in and out of third, you have what we call fourth person perspective taking, Katie. Fourth person.
You can do that all at the same time. Is that what you're saying?
No, conscious control. So it's kind of like I have a perspective on a perspective. I'm aware of which perspective I'm in while I'm in it. That's called fourth. It's like a Jedi skill, if you will. That's like fourth person perspective. There are 8 of these. I won't bore you with the rest, but their fourth person perspective taking is the ability to know whether you're operating from first, second, and third, and to deliberately move in and move out. So it's totally okay to be passionate about things, and then to be a rational observer about things, and then to create common ground. Now, as a leader, if you can step in and step out of any one of those, it's incredibly powerful to help mobilize the troops, align the troops, and help us move successfully forward together.
There's a question from Dirk about saying that is there anything we can do to avoid that it sticks after the meeting is over? People might agree once second perspective has been given, but who says they're serious about it?
Yes, well, that's not really second, right? Because, you know, and you'll see this, it's a classic pathology in organizations, it's sort of almost passive aggressive. Well, I'll agree in the meeting, but I didn't really agree. And I'll go out and either passively resist it or actively resist it outside the meeting. Because my whole team knows I didn't really want to vote for that. I just haven't had the courage to speak up and challenge in the meeting because there wasn't the environment or the psychological safety. So that's
a good point, actually, Alan. Sorry to interrupt, but that's a good point, isn't it? About people feeling safe enough to actually say something, because sometimes it's just easier to go along with whatever's being decided. If you feel you're going to get slapped down, why speak up?
Absolutely true. So that's why organizations often need a bit of help and support and guidance of, how do we have successful, all problems ultimately, Katie, are resolved by quality conversations and to generate wisdom and insights. But, that's easy to say, but much harder to do. So part of the reason for sharing this is to say, well, look, actually one of the real, hopefully, benefits is if people can understand, well, why did we get good in a crisis? Why did we seem to function at a much higher level, get much more done? Companies, setting aside their normal agenda and making ventilators. Formula One, making ventilators machines, because there's a common purpose, because they've dropped their ego, and because they've inadvertently accessed common ground, right? And that's why they perform well in the crisis. Now, once the crisis is over, that might all just get blown away by the wind. And so all the things that we might have learned during the crisis evaporate. So then you think, well, so what have we really learned through this crisis? So what I really hope, and part of the reason for sharing this, is to get some conscious competence, to get some real awareness of the reasons teams, organizations, families may do better in a crisis is their ability to access second person. Second person is where the magic of relationship really exists. So if we can adopt that after the crisis, we'll do better.
So I'm just asking people to kind of either bring out any questions they've got, or actually is anybody noticing that this is actually happening in either a team that they're in or a senior leadership team that they might be part of or have access to. So it'd be interesting to see whether people see that as a phenomenon. But it might be worth just Alan, are there any other sides that you want to show us, or just how people can, what are almost like the three things that we need to kind of bear in mind, because it's quite a lot to take on, in the sense of, can I be in the meeting and also kind of this observer of the meeting at the same time? That's quite a skill.
Yeah, and that's why these skills need to be practiced. And in terms of the point about does it stick after the meeting, one of the things is, if you create some common ground, write it down on the flip chart or the whiteboard, so everybody can see, rather than you think, oh, I've kind of understood what everybody's saying here, and you never check. So make it explicit, verbally and preferably in written form. Write it all down so everybody can see what it is you think is common to all of us. So have we all agreed that we need to, make this budgetary number by this date? Have we all agreed that the first thing we need to do is this? And you write it down, and the act of writing it down, people say, well, hang on, I thought I agreed, but when you actually wrote it down, what I understood was something slightly different to that. Okay, so let's flush that out. So the reason it doesn't stick is we're never really explicit. We never either verbally call it out, slow down, and take the time to make sure, look around the room, and everybody's going, yes, I'm entirely happy with that.
And does that always have to be the top man or woman doing that? You know, who's taking that role? Because that's quite a central role, isn't it?
Well, when teams get really effective as a team, anyone in the room can do it. So when everybody's skilled up in first, second, and third person perspective taking, you can even call this out. Look, we're getting absolutely wrapped up. We're all popcorning. And so when we talk this to companies, they actually start to use this, you know, this language now. We're popcorning. We're popcorning. You know, we're not reaching any kind of common agreement, a common ground. So anybody in the team or in the room even can say, well, hang on a minute. You know, I think something common is emerging here. We all seem to be saying slightly different variations of this thing, and it's offered to the room. And then people pop off again and, well, I disagree with that. That's not what we're saying at all, and blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, we've been talking for 15 minutes. You know, we're not seem to be getting anywhere. That's first and third right there. Okay, well, again, keep making first and third observations is fine, but what can we agree? Can we even agree that we're not getting anywhere? That would be progress, right? Okay, so we can agree we're not getting anywhere. Right, so let's stop. Why aren't we getting anywhere? Well, it's because Frank is being a pain, blah, 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 and off that first person. You know, well, it's not Frank, you know, we're all responsible here. And again, off the first and third goes again. And so people need to practice, you know, calling out some simple basics, writing them down. Can we agree 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Right, at least we've locked that in. Now let's zoom in on the bit where we disagree, you know, either higher up or lower down. So that's the process. I really, in terms of takeaway, I'd encourage people, first of all, notice in any conversation they have after today, am I coming from the first person, the third person, or do occasionally I slip into second? And when I get into second, when I set aside my own belief or set aside the facts, how does that feel energetically? Does that feel any different? What I'd suggest to people is they just, number one, start to notice. No change without awareness. It starts with being aware of, which one am I in? Am I in first, second, or third? Which one am I in? And then see if they can go in and out of first. So when the dander's up, can they back out of the emotionality of that and make an observation? Right? Can they actually set aside the desire? So often people you'll see in meetings have an overwhelming compulsion to speak, even if what they're saying is irrelevant or distracting or completely on another topic, but they've got to say it. That's first person. Or they feel they have to point something out. So can you
stop people doing that?
Well, you've got to start paying attention, right? You've got to start paying attention. Am I stuck in first? Is Frank stuck in first? Is Alice stuck in first? Is Alice stuck in third? And so that's why we introduce this framework, so people can start to notice, which perspective they're operating from, which perspective other people's are operating from, and start to develop a skill. Step into first, come out to first. Step into third, come out to third. Try and step into second with those tips that I gave you. Step into second and see what happens if you set aside any desire to achieve anything other than create alignment. What happens then? So it's a practice, Katie. One has to just practice getting good at this stuff. But I can tell you, when you're really good at this, and when the whole team is good at this, the speed and efficiency and effectiveness of those meetings goes off the charts. I mean, it becomes amazing how much teams can do in the same amount of time when they understand perspectives and don't get stuck in the first, third arm wrestle.
Okay, thanks, Alan. I haven't seen any other questions in the chat. If there's any other questions that you guys would like to ask, what videos or reading would you recommend for this? Says Alexandra.
Well, I've dropped into detail in this in the 4D leadership book. So if people want to read a real detailed expansion and just sort of noodle on that, rewatch this video because I'm explaining something quite subtle here, but it really is a game changer when you realize you're operating from one of these three perspectives. It's a game changer to all relationships. So, let me just finish with a story. We did this with a client once, and we set them up to talk to each other, and we deliberately set them up to have an argument in an adversarial position. I want you to advocate for, I don't know, cost, and you to advocate for quality. Go. And they just hit loggerheads. And then something interesting is the woman in that debate with this chap realized she was getting nowhere. So she decided, just without any instruction, to drop her whole line of argument and just became fascinated with the other person. But, well, I'm not getting I'm not being able to impose my view. I'll just see if I can understand theirs. And suddenly they got into second person, and it was so incredibly intimate. So when we sort of said, stop, let's debrief, they couldn't, not keep talking, because they were having a level of intimacy which those two executives never experienced. And even when we went to lunch, it was still going, and there was kind of like an energy in the room. What's going on between these two people? It was almost like they're having a date, and it's incredibly powerful. And what was really happening was an incredible, strong relationship bond was being built live before our very eyes. And that's the power of second person when you properly access it. It creates common understanding and connection. And in this world, and we'll talk about this next week, where we are a bit disconnected, being able to get in to second person perspective is part of the antidote to the disconnection and isolation we might feel when we're socially isolated.
Okay, thanks, Alan. All right, thank you, guys. Thank you, Alan. Thank you for your time today and for spending that with us. As Alan says, next week we're going to be talking about separation, isolation, and loneliness. I will be able to cheer you up in that process as well. But same time, same place, and hope you really will join us then. So thanks again very much. Bye bye.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.